Before we start, lock the door behind you. Turn the lights down low. Put your headphones on if you've got them, because some of what you're about to hear was barely audible the first time it was reported. A whisper caught on a recorder. A knock too soft to be sure it happened at all. These are 6 stories. People swear they happened. Names have been changed. Locations kept vague. For obvious reasons, some of these accounts come from old case files. Some come from people who never wanted to talk about it again, but did anyway. Because silence was worse, I'm not asking you to believe all of it. I'm asking you to listen to all of it, because by the 3rd story, you'll stop asking yourself if this is real, and start asking yourself what you'd have done differently. Stay until the end. The 6th story is the one people message me about at 3 in the morning, asking if I made it up. I didn't. Let's begin. Story 1. The Night Shift at Mercy Drive. In the autumn of 2014, a woman named Diane Castellano took a job nobody else wanted. She was 41 years old, recently divorced, and behind on a mortgage she couldn't talk about without her voice cracking. The position was overnight security at a decommissioned wing of a hospital, Mercy Drive Medical Center, a real facility that had operated for 60 years before budget cuts shut down its East Wing in 2009. The West Wing stayed open, emergency room, maternity ward, the usual hum of a working hospital, but the East Wing, 3 floors of old patient rooms, an outdated surgical theater, and a basement morgue that hadn't processed a body in 5 years, sat empty, dark, waiting for a renovation contract that kept falling through. Diane's job was simple on paper. Walk the East Wing twice a night, check that the doors were locked, the pipes weren't leaking, nobody was squatting in the old rooms, 8-hour shifts, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 5 nights a week. The pay was almost insulting for what she'd later describe as the worst decision of her life. But it was pay, and pay was pay. The first 2 weeks were uneventful, Diane has said, in the few interviews she's given since, that the East Wing felt like any abandoned building feels. Heavy with a kind of stillness that presses on your ears. Dust on the gurneys nobody had wheeled out. Curtains still drawn around beds where patients had once waited for news. She'd walk her route with a flashlight and a 2-way radio, humming to herself, trying not to think too hard about the fact that people had died on that floor. A lot of people. It was a hospital. After all, it was the start of the 3rd week when things changed. She was on her 2nd walkthrough of the night, somewhere around 2:30 in the morning, moving down the corridor that led to the old surgical theater. When she heard it, a wheelchair, the unmistakable squeak roll of rubber wheels on linoleum, moving steadily behind her. Maybe 30 feet back, Diane turned. The corridor was empty. No wheelchair. No shadow retreating into a doorway. Just the long stretch of tile reflecting her flashlight beam back at her. And silence so complete she could hear her own pulse in her ears. She told herself it was the building settling. Old hospitals do that. Pipes contract. Floors shift. Sounds travel strangely through empty halls. She finished her walkthrough faster than usual and clocked the rest of the shift sitting in her car in the parking lot rather than the security office. Telling her supervisor the office heater was broken. It wasn't. She just didn't want to be inside. The wheelchair sound came back 4 nights later. This time it didn't stop when she turned around. It kept rolling, slow and rhythmic, somewhere just out of the beam of her flashlight, always staying in the dark margin at the edge of what she could see. She called out, said something like, "Hello? Is someone there?" And the sound stopped instantly, not faded, stopped. The way a record stops when you lift the needle. Diane has talked, in those rare interviews, about the particular quality of silence that followed. She said most silences have a texture to them, the hum of a refrigerator somewhere, traffic in the distance, your own breathing. This silence had none of that. It felt, in her words, like something had reached out and turned the volume down on the entire building, deliberately, so she'd notice the absence. She stood in that corridor for almost a full minute before her legs would move again. Diane requested a transfer to the West Wing. Her supervisor, a heavy-set man named Carl who'd worked at Mercy Drive for almost 2 decades and treated the East Wing's reputation with the weary dismissal of someone who'd heard every variation of "this place is haunted" from a dozen previous guards, told her there were no open positions, but he'd look into the maintenance logs for the East Wing, see if there was a structural issue causing noise. He never got back to her. She kept the job because she needed the money, and she told herself, the way people do, that she could handle it. Worse things happen to people every day. She'd grit her teeth through 8-hour shifts and a wheelchair. That wasn't there. She started bringing things with her that she never would have considered necessary before. A small Bluetooth speaker, so there'd be music filling the silence instead of her own footsteps. A second flashlight, in case the first one died. Though she's noted that her flashlights, both of them, started developing a habit of flickering specifically when she walked past room 214, a patient room near the center of the East Wing's second floor that, as far as she could tell from the building's old directory, had no particular history attached to it, no plaque, no story, nothing she could point to, just a door that her equipment seemed to dislike. She mentioned this to Carl once, half joking, hoping he'd laugh it off and make her feel foolish for noticing. He didn't laugh. He went quiet for a second, the kind of quiet that told her more than words would have, and then said, "Just don't linger there. Walk past it. Don't stop walking." She asked him why. He said he didn't know, that it was just something the guards before her had mentioned too, and that he'd rather not think too hard about why 3 separate people who'd never spoken to each other had all said the same thing about the same door. It was the surgical theater that broke that resolve. The old surgical theater on the East Wing's second floor had been sealed since the wing closed. A heavy double door with a chain and padlock added sometime after a string of break-ins by teenagers looking for a thrill. Diane's job included checking that the padlock was intact. It always was, until the night in early November when she rounded the corner and found the doors standing open. Not broken open, not forced, open. The chain looped neatly over the door handle. The padlock sitting closed on the floor beside it, as if someone had unlocked it properly and simply forgotten to remove the chain. Diane radioed her supervisor immediately. He told her to wait for him before going in, that he'd come check it out, and that it was probably kids who'd gotten a copy of the key somehow. She waited in the hallway, flashlight trained on that open doorway, for 11 minutes before he arrived. She has said those 11 minutes felt longer than any other 11 minutes of her life, because she could hear something moving inside the theater. Not loud, not aggressive, just a soft, dragging shuffle, back and forth, like someone pacing in worn slippers. At one point, around the 6-minute mark by her own estimate, the shuffling stopped, and she heard, faintly, almost beneath the threshold of hearing, what she's described as a long, slow exhale, the kind of breath a person lets out after holding it too long. It came from somewhere near the center of the room, roughly where she knew the old operating table still stood. She didn't call out this time. She didn't want an answer. When her supervisor arrived and they went in together, the theater was empty, dust undisturbed except for a single trail of footprints leading from the center of the room, where the old operating table still stood, stripped of its equipment, to the far wall. The footprints simply stopped at the wall. No door there, no vent large enough for a person. Just brick, painted institutional green, dating back decades. Carl ran his hand along that wall for a long time. Diane remembers, knocking at intervals, listening for a hollow spot, a hidden cavity, anything that would explain it logically. He didn't find one. He told her, in a voice that had lost most of its earlier dismissiveness, that he'd file an incident report and have maintenance look into the wall's structural integrity. Diane asked him, directly, if he believed her, if he believed what they were both standing in front of. He didn't answer that question. He just told her to take the next 2 nights off, paid, and to come back when she felt ready. She came back exactly once more, 4 nights later, specifically to collect a jacket she'd left in the security office. She didn't walk her route that night. She went in, grabbed the jacket, and left within 4 minutes. And even that felt, in her words, like 4 minutes too long. Diane quit 2 days later. She didn't give 2 weeks' notice. She didn't ask for her final paycheck. She drove to Mercy Drive Medical Center, left her keycard and flashlight in an envelope at the West Wing reception desk, and never went back. Here's the detail that didn't come out until much later. When a local historian researching the hospital's past reached out to Diane after hearing about her resignation through a mutual contact, in 1987, the East Wing's surgical theater had been the site of what hospital records euphemistically called an adverse outcome. A surgeon, well-respected, with 20 years of experience, had a psychotic break mid-procedure. The patient didn't survive. The surgeon was led out of the theater that night by hospital security, sedated, restrained, and still talking, according to one witness's account passed down informally, about a presence in the room that had been asking him to finish. The historian dug further, pulling old staffing records from the hospital archive, and found something that made Diane go cold when she heard it secondhand. The patient room the surgeon had operated near earlier that same shift, before whatever happened in the theater took hold of him, was room 214, the same room her flashlights kept flickering past, the same room Carl had told her, without explanation, never to linger near. The surgeon, according to the historian's research, was never able to return to practicing medicine. He spent the remainder of his career, brief as it was, in psychiatric care, and reportedly told one of his treating physicians a single sentence that made its way, secondhand and unverified, into hospital lore. That the thing in the theater hadn't wanted the patient to die. It had wanted him to keep going. It had wanted, in his words, one more cut. Just one more. It kept saying it was almost finished. The East Wing of Mercy Drive Medical Center is still closed. The renovation contract still hasn't gone through. As far as anyone knows, no security guard has held the overnight position for longer than 6 weeks since Diane Castellano left. One former colleague of Carl's, contacted years later by a podcast researcher digging into the hospital's reputation, claimed that the wing had quietly cycled through 11 different overnight guards in the years since Diane's resignation, none lasting more than a month and a half, several quitting without notice in a pattern that started to feel less like coincidence and more like a kind of attrition the building itself seemed to be enforcing. The hospital's official statement, when the podcast reached out for comment, was a brief acknowledgement that staffing turnover in the East Wing security position has been higher than average, and a declined request for further detail. She still won't say what she thinks was behind that wall. Story 2. The Rental on Cedarview Lane. Sometimes the scariest stories aren't about hospitals or abandoned asylums. Sometimes they happen in a perfectly ordinary 3-bedroom house on a perfectly ordinary street. The kind you drive past 100 times without a second look. That's what makes this next one harder to shake. In the summer of 2019, a couple named Marcus and Priya Okafor, names changed at their request, moved into a rental house on a quiet residential street they're calling Cedarview Lane. It was their first home together, newly married, both working remote jobs, looking for a quiet place outside the city to start their life. The house had been on the rental market for almost a year before they found it, which in hindsight, Priya says, should have been the first red flag. A clean, updated, reasonably priced 3-bedroom house, in a good neighborhood, sitting empty for a year? Nobody thought to ask why. The landlord was an elderly man who managed the property through an agency and never appeared in person. All communication went through email, short, formal, vaguely stilted messages that Priya, looking back, has described as reading almost like they'd been translated from another language, or written by someone unfamiliar with how landlords usually talk. The lease was signed, the deposit paid, and the Okafors moved in on a Saturday in June with a U-Haul and a lot of optimism. The first month was unremarkable. They unpacked, painted the guest room a soft sage green, planted tomatoes in the backyard, hosted Marcus's parents for a housewarming dinner that went late into the night with wine and laughter spilling out onto the back patio. It was, by every account either of them has given, a genuinely happy time. It was Priya who first noticed the smell. Faint, sweetish, coming from somewhere in the hallway closet outside the second bedroom. They assumed something had died in the walls, a mouse or a squirrel, and called an exterminator. The exterminator found nothing, no nest, no carcass, no entry point. He told them sometimes old houses just smell, especially after long vacancies, and the odor would likely fade. It did fade, over about 2 weeks. They didn't think about it again until October. That's when Marcus started losing time. He's described it carefully in the limited interviews he's given, because he's aware of how it sounds. He'd be sitting at his desk in the home office, working, and the next thing he knew, hours had passed. Not the normal kind of losing track of time that happens when you're absorbed in a task. He'd look up from his laptop and it would be dark outside when he was certain it had been mid-afternoon. He'd find half-written emails on his screen with no memory of typing them. Sentences that trailed into nonsense. Words repeated 6, 7 times in a row like a stuck record. The same word, over and over, filling half a paragraph before trailing into gibberish, like a skipping needle on a record player. The first time it happened, he showed Priya the email rather than deleting it, more confused than afraid, joking weakly that he must have fallen asleep at his keyboard without realizing it. She laughed along with him, because it seemed, at the time, like exactly the kind of harmless, almost funny thing that happens to overworked people. Neither of them was laughing by the 4th or 5th occurrence. Priya noticed it too, not from the inside, but from the outside. She'd come home from errands and find Marcus standing in the hallway closet, the same one that had smelled strange in June, just standing there with the door open, staring at the back wall. Once, she said, she stood and watched him for almost a full minute before he noticed her. He didn't move, didn't blink that she could see, just stood with one hand resting flat against the drywall, as though feeling for a heartbeat. When she'd ask him what he was doing, he'd blink, seem disoriented, and have no memory of walking there, let alone how long he'd been standing in that closet. They both assumed stress, new marriage, new house, the isolation of remote work. Marcus saw a doctor, who found nothing physically wrong and gently suggested therapy. He started therapy. The episodes continued and began, according to Priya, to follow a pattern. Always in the late afternoon, always ending with him in or near that closet, always with no memory of the gap. She started keeping a log, almost without deciding to, jotting down times and durations on a notepad she kept in the kitchen. By late October, the pattern was undeniable enough that she brought it to his therapist directly, over his mild objection, and the therapist, to her credit, Priya has said, took it seriously enough to suggest they consider whether something in the house itself might be a contributing factor. It was a gentle, clinical way of broaching an idea neither of them wanted to say out loud yet. It was in November that Priya found the door. She was cleaning out that same hallway closet, finally getting around to organizing it properly on a gray Sunday afternoon while Marcus napped. Exhausted, he'd said, though he'd done nothing that day to warrant it. When she noticed the back wall didn't sit quite flush with the rest of the closet's framing, there was a gap, barely visible, hidden behind a stack of folded linens. She moved the linens aside and found a seam in the drywall. Too straight, too deliberate to be a crack. She got a flashlight and a screwdriver and, against what she now admits was her better judgment, pried at the seam. It was a door, a real door, built into the wall, painted over and papered to match the closet, with a small brass handle recessed flush into the surface so it wouldn't be noticeable unless you knew exactly where to look. It led to a narrow space, not quite a room, more of a crawl space, maybe 4 feet wide and 8 feet long, with just enough headroom to crouch, and inside it, dust-covered but unmistakable, a child's mattress on the floor, a single bare bulb on a pull string, and on the wall, scratched into the drywall in dozens of overlapping lines, were tally marks, hundreds of them, grouped in fives. The way people count days, Priya has said the air inside that space felt different, colder than it had any right to be. Given it was sealed and insulated from the rest of the house, and carrying the faintest trace of that same sweetish smell that had bothered them back in June. She didn't go all the way in. She got as far as the threshold, flashlight shaking in her hand, and called for Marcus. Priya called Marcus into the closet. He stood in the doorway of the hidden room and went pale, then quiet, and told her, for the first time, that he recognized it. He didn't know how. He'd never been in that space before that moment, as far as he could remember, but something about the dimensions, the angle of the bulb, the specific pattern of the tally marks, felt overwhelmingly, sickeningly familiar. He told her, in a voice she described as barely above a whisper, that he could have told her how many tally marks were on that wall before he'd ever counted them. He was right, there were 318. He'd guessed the number almost exactly, off by only a handful. They called the rental agency the next morning. The agency claimed no knowledge of any hidden room and said the landlord, who they'd still never met or even spoken to by phone, was unreachable for comment. The agent who took the call, according to Priya, grew noticeably less cooperative as the conversation continued, eventually suggesting, with what Priya read as forced casualness, that the Okafors simply not worry about it and avoid that closet going forward. The Okafors broke their lease that week, eating the cost of the remaining 10 months, and moved out within 4 days. It was a local journalist, working on an unrelated piece about property records in the area, who later uncovered what had happened in that house. In 1996, the home had been owned by a family whose name has been kept out of public reporting due to the presence of surviving relatives. Their 9-year-old daughter was reported missing in the spring of that year. The case was never solved. No body was ever found. The investigation files, which the journalist obtained through a public records request, note that the family's home was searched twice by police, but neither search report mentions a hidden room behind the hallway closet. The journalist did find one detail in an old newspaper clipping that the official case file omitted entirely. A neighbor, interviewed at the time, who said she'd occasionally heard what she described as tapping coming from the direction of that house late at night, in the weeks before the girl was reported missing. but had dismissed it as pipes. The house on Cedarview Lane has changed ownership twice more since the Okafors moved out. Property records show it now sits vacant again. The listing photos, the last time anyone checked, still show that hallway closet, linens neatly folded, the wall behind them painted and unremarkable. Priya has said one more thing, almost as an afterthought in her final interview on the subject, that she's never been able to fully explain in the weeks after they moved out. While staying temporarily with Marcus's parents, she found herself counting things compulsively: stairs, ceiling tiles, the slats in a fence, without meaning to. The way you might hum a song stuck in your head, she didn't connect it to the tally marks until she caught herself. One night, having counted to 318 without any memory of starting, Marcus says he still dreams about the tally marks. He says in the dream, he's the one making them. Story 3. The last delivery on Route 9. This next story comes from the trucking world, a community that, if you've ever talked to long-haul drivers, has no shortage of strange stories about empty highways at 3 in the morning, but this one was passed to me by the driver's own brother. After the driver in question stopped answering anyone's calls, his name was Tomas Reyes, 34 years old, an 8-year veteran of long-haul trucking, driving primarily overnight routes through a stretch of rural highway his company referred to internally as Route 9, a 60-mile corridor through farmland and forest, connecting a regional distribution center to a string of small towns. He'd run that route easily 200 times. He knew every gas station, every rest stop, every diner that stayed open past midnight, every spot where the radio signal dropped out for exactly 90 seconds before picking back up. He has said, in a recorded statement given to his brother and later transcribed for an online trucking forum, that Route 9 was about as routine and boring as driving got, boring enough that he'd developed small rituals to keep himself alert. A particular gas station coffee at mile 30, a playlist he rotated through in a specific order, a habit of counting mile markers out loud just to hear his own voice in the empty cab, until the night of February the 11th. He was hauling a standard freight load, nothing unusual, departing the distribution center at 11 p.m. for a delivery scheduled at 4 a.m. The first 40 miles passed without incident, cold, clear. A sky full of stars uninterrupted by any city light for miles in either direction. The kind of night that, under different circumstances, he said he might have called beautiful. It was around mile 45. In a stretch of highway flanked by dense pine forest with no lighting and no cell signal, that Tomas first saw the woman on the side of the road. She was standing maybe 10 feet from the shoulder, facing away from the highway, wearing what he described as a pale or white dress. Despite the temperature being well below freezing that night, no coat, no visible breath in the cold air. Though he's admitted he might not have been close enough or paying careful enough attention to notice that detail in the moment. It only occurred to him later. Lying awake, replaying it, he slowed instinctively. Any driver would. Seeing a person standing alone on a deserted highway at 1 in the morning. But something about her stillness made him hesitate to stop completely. She didn't turn. She didn't wave him down. She just stood there, facing the tree line, as his headlights swept across her. Her dark hair hanging straight and motionless despite a wind strong enough that night to be visibly bending the treetops behind her. Tomas kept driving. He told his brother later that he immediately regretted not stopping, that the rational part of his brain was already constructing the headline. Local trucker fails to help stranded woman. Woman found dead of exposure, and he almost turned the truck around. He actually started to, he said, easing off the accelerator with the intention of finding a place to turn the rig around at the next wide shoulder. But something stopped him. He's described it as a physical sensation, a tightening in his chest, an instinct screaming that turning around was the single worst decision available to him in that moment. Louder and more certain than any instinct he'd felt before or since, he kept driving. In his mirror, he watched the woman for as long as the road allowed him to see her. She still hadn't moved, hadn't turned around. 15 minutes later, at mile 60, on a different stretch of the same highway, he saw her again, same white dress, same posture, facing away from the road. This time standing beside a different patch of tree line that he was certain, having driven this route hundreds of times, was at least 15 miles from where he'd first seen her. There was no side road connecting the 2 points. No way, by any conventional means, for a person on foot to have covered that distance in 15 minutes, let alone in a thin dress, on terrain that consisted largely of dense forest and a drainage ditch running parallel to the highway. This time, Tomas didn't slow down at all. He has said his hands were shaking on the wheel hard enough that he had to grip it tighter to keep the truck steady, and that he found himself talking out loud in the cab. Not to anyone. Just narrating his own actions. Okay. Just keep driving. Just get to the drop-off. Just keep driving. The way people do when they're trying to keep panic at arm's length through sheer repetition. He called his dispatcher on the radio, his voice audibly unsteady according to the dispatcher's own later account, and asked if anyone else had reported anything strange on Route 9 that night. The dispatcher said no, and asked if he was okay to continue. He said yes, because the alternative was admitting something he wasn't ready to admit, even to himself. He saw her a third time at mile 72. This time, she was facing the road. Tomas has only described her face once, in the recorded statement to his brother, and he reportedly broke down partway through and refused to continue. What he did say was that her face looked correct in every individual detail. Eyes, nose, mouth, all present, all proportioned the way a face should be, but that looking at it produced a wrongness he couldn't articulate. The way an image looks wrong when you realize, a half second too late, that something in it has been digitally altered. Her skin, he said, had a quality to it under the headlights that he could only compare to wax. Not quite matte, not quite reflective. Sitting somewhere in between that the eye doesn't expect from a living face. He said her mouth was moving, as if she were speaking. But the cab of the truck was sealed and he was doing 60 miles an hour, and there was no way he should have been able to hear anything. He heard her anyway, clear as if she were sitting in the passenger seat beside him. He has refused to repeat what she said, beyond saying once. In a moment his brother described as the only time he's ever seen Tomas cry, that it wasn't a threat, it was worse than a threat. Somehow, though he could never explain to his brother's satisfaction why a non-threatening sentence had affected him so profoundly, he didn't stop, he didn't slow down. He drove the remaining distance to his delivery point well over the speed limit, made the drop-off in record time. The receiving warehouse manager later mentioned, almost as an aside, that Tomas had looked like he'd seen a ghost, not realizing how literally accurate the comment might have been, and immediately called his dispatcher to request reassignment off Route 9 permanently. The company complied without asking many questions. Apparently Tomas wasn't the first driver to make that request, though he was the first to do so in a single phone call rather than a gradual pattern of canceled shifts. His brother, in relaying the story, added one detail that Tomas himself has never publicly confirmed or denied. Route 9 runs parallel, for much of its length, to an old rail line that was decommissioned in the 1950s after a series of accidents. Local historical records, available through the county archive, document at least one incident in 1949 in which a young woman in a pale dress was struck and killed while walking along the tracks at night, reportedly on her way to meet someone who never arrived. The newspaper account from that year, brief and matter-of-fact in the way old local papers tended to report tragedy, noted that the woman's family never fully accepted the circumstances of her death, and that her mother, 4 years afterward, would reportedly walk that same stretch of track at night, calling her daughter's name, convinced she hadn't really died at all, just gotten lost, somewhere out there in the dark, waiting to be found. Tomas Reyes still drives for the same company. He has never driven Route 9 again, and according to his brother, he changes the subject immediately if anyone brings it up, sometimes leaving the room entirely if the conversation doesn't move on quickly enough. The dispatcher who took his call that night has said only one thing publicly about the incident: that in 15 years of dispatching overnight routes, she had never heard a grown man's voice shake the way his did that night, and she has never asked him to elaborate on what he saw. A handful of other drivers for the same company have, over the years, posted anonymously to the same trucking forum where Tomas's brother first shared this account, claiming similar sightings on that stretch of Route 9. Never identical, but always a woman, always in pale clothing, always near the old rail corridor. None of the posts have ever been verified. Most are deleted by their authors within days of posting, as though the act of writing it down was enough, and continuing to let it sit in public view became its own kind of risk. Story 4. The voicemail. Take a short breath before this one. It's shorter than the others, but people tell me it's the one that stays with them the longest, because unlike the others, there's a piece of physical evidence that, as far as anyone can determine, still exists. In 2017, a college student named Hannah Voss, attending a state university she's asked not be named, received a voicemail from her younger sister, Erin, at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in October. Hannah was asleep and didn't hear the call come in. She found the voicemail the next morning when she woke up for an early class. Her phone showing a single missed call and a notification icon she almost dismissed without opening. Already half focused on getting dressed and making coffee in time, the two sisters were close. Erin was 19, a sophomore at a different university roughly 4 hours away, and they talked most days, usually by text, occasionally by call when something needed more than a text coup. LD carry. The 2:47 a.m. voicemail wasn't entirely out of character for Erin, who Hannah has described as a night owl prone to late bursts of emotion that needed an outlet. The kind of person who'd call crying about a breakup at 1 in the morning and be perfectly fine, laughing about it. By lunch the next day, Hannah assumed, listening to her phone buzz with the notification, that it was probably about a boy, or a fight with a roommate, or one of a dozen ordinary late-night college student crises. She played the voicemail while brushing her teeth, only half paying attention, toothbrush still in her mouth, ready to laugh off whatever minor drama had prompted the call. The recording was 51 seconds long. For the first several seconds, there was nothing but quiet ambient noise, what sounded like Erin's dorm room, the faint hum of an air conditioner, maybe the rustle of fabric, as if the phone had been picked up mid-motion. Then Erin's voice, quiet, controlled in a way that Hannah immediately recognized as wrong, because Erin's normal voice was loud and unguarded, prone to talking over itself when excited or upset, and this voice was speaking in something close to a whisper, flat, measured, every word placed with a deliberate care that Hannah has said made the hair on her arms stand up before she'd even processed what was being said. What Erin said, according to the voicemail transcript that Hannah later had transcribed by a forensic audio service, a detail that becomes important later, was this: Hannah, if you get this, don't call me back, don't come here. I need you to call the campus police and tell them to check room 211 in Linkvist Hall. But don't tell them I called you. And don't. Here the recording cuts, not to silence, but to a sound Hannah has described as similar to a held breath being released all at once. Like a sigh but wrong, too long, too controlled, drawn out for what the audio analysis later measured at nearly 4 full seconds, far longer than a natural human exhale typically lasts. Then nothing. The voicemail ends at 51 seconds. Hannah's first reaction, by her own account, was a strange kind of paralysis, toothbrush still in hand, staring at her phone screen, replaying the message in her head before she'd even consciously decided to call anyone back. Hannah called her sister back immediately. No answer. She called again. No answer. She called campus police at Erin's university, hands shaking badly enough that she had to redial twice after misdialing the number, and explained the voicemail as clearly as she could manage. The dispatcher, by Hannah's account, treated the call with the mild skepticism such calls usually receive. These things are, more often than not, exactly the kind of overreaction to a late-night prank or drunken joke that campus police field constantly, but agreed to send an officer to check room 211 in Lindqvist Hall as a welfare check. The 20 minutes Hannah spent waiting for a callback are, she said, among the worst 20 minutes of her life. Sitting on her dorm room floor, phone gripped in both hands, replaying the voicemail over and over, trying to parse some hidden clue in the tone, the pacing, the cut-off sentence, anything that might tell her what was actually happening 4 hours away. Erin was found in her dorm room, unharmed, asleep, with no memory of making the call. Her roommate confirmed Erin had gone to bed around midnight and, to the roommate's knowledge, had not left the room or made any calls afterward. Had, in fact, been asleep and snoring softly when the officer's knock woke both of them. Disoriented and confused at being roused at 3 in the morning by campus police, Erin's phone showed no outgoing call to Hannah at 2:47 a.m. No call log entry. Nothing. The phone's battery history, when Hannah later asked a tech-savvy friend to check, showed no unusual drain or activity consistent with an outgoing call at that hour either. Hannah's phone, however, showed the voicemail, still does, as far as anyone publicly knows. She has reportedly kept the original phone, and used and fully charged in a drawer, specifically so the voicemail is never deleted or lost to a software update or a forced migration to a new device. She had it professionally analyzed twice, by 2 separate audio forensic services she found independently, specifically so neither analysis could be influenced by the other's findings. Both audio engineers confirmed the voice belonged to Erin, with what one report described as a confidence rating consistent with a positive identification. And both engineers separately flagged the same anomaly without prompting from each other. Underneath Erin's voice, in the quiet seconds before she starts speaking, there's a second voice, much fainter, unintelligible as words, but present, layered just beneath the audible track, like a recording made in a room with someone else murmuring nearby, just out of range of the emissary phone. Neither audio engineer could identify what the second voice was saying. One of them, in a written note attached to his analysis, added an observation he admitted wasn't part of his formal scope of work, that the cadence of the underlying voice didn't match normal speech patterns. It repeated the same fragment over and over, roughly every 4 seconds, for the full duration of the quiet portion of the recording. A looping phrase too quiet to make out, but rhythmically too consistent to be incidental background noise. More like a chant or a recitation than ordinary conversation. Erin has no explanation for the call. She has stated, in the only public comment she's made about the incident, in a brief written statement she gave Hannah permission to share, that she has no memory of October the 11th past around 11 p.m., and that she's chosen not to think about it too hard, because thinking about it makes her unable to sleep. She transferred universities the following semester, citing vague personal reasons to anyone who asked, and has never lived in a dorm room again. She rents a small studio apartment now, alone, with what Hannah describes as an unusual number of locks on the door for someone living in a low-crime college town. Hannah still has the voicemail. She has said she's listened to it exactly 4 times since the night it happened. Once to make the police call, twice for the audio engineers, and once against her own better judgment, alone, late at night, trying to figure out what the underlying voice was saying. Headphones pressed tight against her ears, volume pushed as high as it would go. She says she figured it out on the fourth listen. She has never told anyone what it was. Erin's parents, contacted years later by the same forum moderator who'd helped Hannah verify the audio engineer's credentials, declined to discuss the incident at all, beyond a single brief statement asking that the family's privacy be respected. Hannah has read that response. She said, as confirmation of something rather than a denial of it. Though she's quick to add she has no proof, only a sister's intuition that something in that family's collective silence runs deeper than ordinary discomfort. Story 5. The Cabin at Blackwater Ridge. This story takes us into the woods, which, if you've watched enough of my videos, you already know is where I think the worst stories happen. There's something about distance from other people that changes what's allowed to happen to you. This one comes from a group of 4 friends who, in 2021, rented a cabin for what was supposed to be a relaxing long weekend, and ended up with a story that 2 of them still won't fully discuss. The group consisted of 2 couples, going by the names Jake and Sam, and Carla and Wei, all in their late 20s, longtime friends from college reuniting for a weekend getaway they'd been planning for months. The kind of trip that gets pushed back repeatedly by work schedules until everyone finally commits to a date and refuses to let anything move it again. They'd booked a remote cabin through a vacation rental site, listed under a property they're now calling Blackwater Ridge, located several miles up an unpaved access road in a heavily forested mountain region with no cell service for the final stretch of the drive. The listing photos showed a charming, rustic A-frame cabin with a stone fireplace and a wraparound deck overlooking a valley. The kind of place that looked plucked from a cozy autumn magazine spread. The reviews were good, 4.8 stars. Dozens of glowing comments about the peaceful isolation. Several mentioning how rare it was to find a rental that far off the grid still kept so clean and well-maintained. They arrived on a Friday afternoon in late September. The drive up taking nearly 40 minutes longer than the GPS had estimated due to the state of the unpaved road. Switchbacks narrowing at points to barely the width of their SUV. The first night was exactly what they'd hoped for. A fire, drinks, card games. The kind of easy laughter that happens when old friends haven't seen each other in too long. They went to bed around midnight, 2 to a room, planning a hike for the next morning. The cabin settling into the particular quiet that only exists miles from any other sign of human life. Carla was the first to wake, somewhere around 4 a.m., to the sound of someone walking on the deck outside her window. Slow, deliberate footsteps, the wood creaking under what sounded like significant weight. Not the light, quick steps of someone simply stepping out for fresh air, but a heavier, more measured gait, almost ceremonial in its slowness. She assumed it was Jake or Wei. Unable to sleep, getting some air, she almost got up to join them. Instead, she checked her phone. No signal, but the clock still worked, saw the time, and decided to go back to sleep rather than wander out into tea. Cold. The footsteps continued for what she estimates was another 20 minutes. Slow circuits of the deck, pausing periodically outside different windows, lingering at each one for 10, 15 seconds before moving on to the next. As though checking each room in turn, she didn't think much of it until breakfast, when she mentioned it casually to the group, expecting someone to admit it had been them, and watched all 3 of her friends' faces go still instead. None of them had been awake. None of them had gone outside. Wei, in fact, had been a notoriously light sleeper their entire friendship and insisted he would have woken at even the first creak of a deck board. And he'd slept through the entire night undisturbed. They checked the deck for footprints. The morning had brought a light frost, just enough to hold an impression, and the deck boards showed nothing. No boot prints. No marks of any kind. despite the fact that all four of them now agreed the sound had been distinct and heavy, the kind of footfall that should have left some trace in frost-covered wood. Jake, ever the rationalist of the group, spent almost 20 minutes running theories past the others, settling foundations, wildlife, wind moving a loose board, none of which accounted for the rhythm Carla described. The deliberate pauses at each window, they laughed it off. Mostly, the way groups of friends do when they've collectively decided not to let one strange night ruin a weekend they'd looked forward to for months. They went hiking, following a trail down to a creek bed and back, took photos, ate lunch on a rock outcropping overlooking the valley. They had a good day. By every account, it was that evening, their second night, when things shifted from strange to something closer to frightening. Wei was the one who found the basement door unlocked. The cabin's listing hadn't mentioned a basement at all. The group had assumed, based on the rental description, that the cabin was a single-level structure plus a sleeping loft, but behind a door they'd all assumed was a closet, off the kitchen. Tucked behind a hanging row of coats that had been left by some previous occupant, Wei found a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The door's lock mechanism hanging loose as though it had been forced from the inside rather than the outside. Splintered wood around the latch, facing inward, not outward, against the better judgment of at least two of the four. The group went down together, using their phone flashlights, Sam voicing the loudest objection and being outvoted by the others' curiosity. The basement was a single unfinished room. Concrete floor, exposed support beams, and almost entirely empty except for one object positioned in the exact center of the room. A wooden chair, old, simple, handmade, facing the staircase, as if positioned for someone to sit and watch anyone who came down. On the chair, neatly folded, was a child's sweater, small, hand-knitted, faded with age, but folded with a precision that felt deliberate rather than incidental. The kind of folding you do when you're trying to preserve something, not when you're discarding it. Carla, the only one of the four with young nieces and nephews, was the one who recognized the size immediately. Small enough for a child no older than 4 or 5. None of them touched it. They went back upstairs, locked the basement door as best they could using a chair wedged under the handle, and had a long, quiet conversation about leaving immediately versus waiting until morning. Given that the drive down the unpaved access road in full darkness carried its own risks, sharp switchbacks, no guardrails, no cell signal to call for help if anything went wrong, they decided to wait. But nobody slept much. Jake has said he spent most of the night sitting up in bed, listening, and around 2 a.m. heard the same slow footsteps on the deck again. Except this time, they stopped directly outside his and Sam's bedroom window and stayed there, not pacing, just standing, for nearly an hour, by his estimate, before finally moving on. He said that at one point, he was certain, though he's never been able to fully convince himself it wasn't imagination born of exhaustion and fear, that he heard breathing on the other side of the glass, slow and even perfectly matched to the rhythm of someone standing very still and very patient. Sam, lying beside him, has corroborated at least part of this. She says she woke briefly sometime in the night to find Jake sitting bolt upright, completely rigid, staring at the curtain window, and that when she whispered to ask what was wrong, he simply held up a hand for silence, the way you'd quiet someone in a library, and didn't speak again until well after the sound outside had stopped. She didn't ask him about it until they were safely back in the car the next day, and even then, he could only describe the feeling of being watched, patiently, almost curiously, the way you might watch an animal in an enclosure rather than the way a person watches another person. In the other bedroom, Carla and Wei had a quieter but equally unsettling night. Carla has said she dreamed, vividly and repeatedly, of the same basement room. Except in the dream the chair wasn't empty. There was a small figure seated in it, facing away from her, and every time she tried to walk around to see its face, the dream would reset, the figure back in its original position, facing away again, as though she were caught in a loop she couldn't break. She woke each time gasping, and each time, she said, she could have sworn she heard the faint creak of the basement door easing open somewhere below her, though she never had the nerve to check. In the morning, they packed quickly and left without showering, without eating, without doing much of anything beyond loading the car and getting back onto the access road as fast as the terrain allowed. All four of them watching the rearview mirror until the cabin disappeared behind the tree line. Nobody spoke for the first 20 minutes of the drive. It was Sam, scrolling back through the rental listing on her phone once they regained signal partway down the mountain, who noticed the listing had been taken down entirely sometime over the course of their stay. No explanation, no error message. The property simply no longer existed on the platform, and the booking confirmation email, when she checked it, now returned an error when she tried to access the original listing link. They reported the experience to the rental platform support team, who, according to Sam, responded with confusion. Their internal records showed the listing had been removed by the host's account 2 days prior to the group's reported check-in date, which would have meant the cabin was never actually available for booking during their stay at all, despite the fact that they had, undeniably, slept there for 2 nights, charged their credit card, exchanged messages with a host account that no longer appeared to exist anywhere in the platform system. The support representative, after escalating the ticket internally, eventually came back with a brief, almost apologetic message stating only that the matter had been forwarded to the appropriate team and that no further information could be shared. Sam never heard back. The group has not been able to relocate the cabin since the access road. When Jake attempted to find it again using GPS coordinates saved from their drive up, leads to a gate-blocking entry to what the local county records describe as undeveloped forest land, with no structures of any kind on file, no permits, no tax records, no evidence that a cabin had ever legally stood on that parcel. He drove out there once, alone, almost a year later, and stood at that gate for a long time, he said, trying to convince himself the trip up the mountain that weekend had simply happened somewhere else. Some other access road he'd misremembered. He doesn't believe that anymore. He just doesn't have anywhere else to put the memory. Carla still has a photo on her phone of the basement chair. She's shown it to a handful of people. Nobody has been able to tell her why. In every copy of the photo she's tried to share, the folded sweater is missing from the frame, visible to her on the original device, but absent in every screenshot, every text message forward, every printed copy anyone has attempted. The chair sits empty in every version but her own. The four of them have, by mutual unspoken agreement, never planned another group trip since. They still talk, still keep in touch, but Sam has said that something about that weekend put a quiet distance between all of them that's never quite closed. Not estrangement. Exactly. Just an awareness, whenever they're together, that there's a shared experience none of them can fully discuss without one of them eventually going silent and changing the subject. ICT. Story 6. The Family in Apartment 4C. This is the one I mentioned at the start. The one people message me about. I want to say clearly, before we begin, that this account comes secondhand, through a former building superintendent who managed the property for almost 11 years and has since left the industry entirely. He's only told this story a handful of times, and every time, by his own admission, it takes him a few days to feel normal again afterward. I understand that feeling a lot better after putting this story together. The building in question was a mid-sized apartment complex in a dense urban neighborhood, 4 stories, 16 units, built in the 1970s. The kind of unremarkable brick building that exists by the thousands in any city. the sort of place you'd walk past without a second glance. The superintendent, who I'll call Russo, since that was the name he gave when he first told this story publicly on an online forum for building maintenance professionals, started managing the property in 2008, taking over from a previous super who'd retired after nearly 30 years on the job and left behind binders of meticulous notes on every unit, every tenant, every quirk of the aging building's plumbing and wiring. Apartment 4C was occupied when Russo started by a family of 4, a mother, a father, and 2 children, a boy around 8 and a girl around 11. Russo has described them as quiet, polite, unremarkable tenants. They paid rent on time, always a few days early if anything. They didn't complain about the noisy radiator or the slow elevator the way half the building did. The kids said hello in the hallway, the boy occasionally stopping to ask Russo questions about whatever tool he happened to be carrying. The girl shy but always offering a small wave. Russo's interactions with them were minimal but consistently pleasant for almost 2 years. The kind of forgettable normalcy that makes a building feel like it's running the way it's supposed to. It was in late 2010 that Russo started noticing small things. The mother began appearing thinner each time he saw her. Not dramatically, not all at once, but a slow, steady decline that he initially attributed to stress, illness, the ordinary wear of life that he'd seen in plenty of tenants over the years. The father started avoiding eye contact in the hallway, where he'd previously always made friendly small talk about sports or the weather. Now hurrying past with a muttered greeting at most, the children stopped being seen at all. Russo assumed, reasonably, that they'd been enrolled in some kind of after-school program, or were simply growing into the age where kids stop greeting the building super in the hallway. Too cool or too busy for idle hellos, he's mentioned, in later retellings. One specific encounter from that period that stuck with him longer than it should have. He passed the father in the lobby in November of 2010 and made an offhand comment about the kids. Something like, "Haven't seen the little ones in a while. They doing all right?" The father, by Russo's account, went very still for a moment before answering. A pause just a beat too long to be natural, and then said, "They're fine. They're staying close to home lately." Russo didn't think much of it at the time. He's thought about almost nothing else since. The complaints started in early 2011. Other tenants on the 4th floor began reporting a smell from 4C. Not constant, but recurring. Something between rotting food and something else nobody wanted to name directly. A smell one tenant described to Russo as making her physically gag the one time she'd had to walk past the door to reach the stairwell. Russo investigated twice, knocking and getting no answer both times despite hearing movement inside on the second visit. Distinct, deliberate movement, footsteps that paused. As he's described it, like someone standing just on the other side of the door listening to him knock. He left notices. Nobody responded. It was a noise complaint that finally got him inside. A tenant in for B, the apartment sharing a wall with 4C, called Russo directly, distressed, describing a sound she could only characterize as something being dragged over and over, 4 hours, late into the night, heavy enough that she could feel a faint vibration through her own bedroom wall. She told him she'd lain awake counting the repetitions before giving up somewhere past 200. Russo went up immediately, knocked, got no answer, and after weighing his legal standing as the building's representative against his genuine concern for the family's welfare, used his master key. What he found, in his own words from the forum post that first brought the story to public attention, was an apartment in a state of severe neglect, not abandoned, but clearly not properly lived in for some time. Furniture pushed against walls at odd angles, as though arranged to clear a specific path rather than for comfort or function. Windows covered with blankets rather than curtains. blocking out all daylight so completely that Russo needed his flashlight despite it being early afternoon, and a smell that he's described as physically staggering, thick enough that he had to breathe through his mouth. A smell that seemed to get worse rather than better the further he moved into the apartment. The mother answered when he called out, emerging from a back hallway, and Russo has said the sight of her stopped him cold. She'd lost what he estimated as 40 or 50 pounds since he'd last seen her clearly. Her skin had a grayish cast under the dim light, her eyes sunken in a way that made it hard for him to hold her gaze, and she spoke to him in a flat, affectless tone completely unlike the friendly woman he remembered from 2 years earlier. She told him everything was fine, that he needed to leave, that he wasn't supposed to be there. Repeating the phrase, "You're not supposed to be here," 3 times in quick succession, by Russo's recollection, with an intensity that felt less like irritation and more like genuine alarm, Russo asked about the smell, about the noise complaint, and, relevant to a detail that comes later, asked where the children were. The mother told him the kids were at school. It was a Saturday. He didn't correct her. He said, looking back, that something in her expression when she said it made him not want to press the point. A flicker of something that might have been confusion, or might have been a warning. He left, deeply unsettled, and called the police for a welfare check rather than pursuing it himself further. Officers visited the apartment later that day. According to the limited information Russo was able to obtain afterward, building managers aren't generally privy to the details of police welfare checks. The officers found the mother and father both present, both cooperative, both insistent that nothing was wrong and that the children were staying with relatives for an extended visit. No children were located in the apartment. No evidence of distress was documented sufficient to warrant further action. The case, if it was ever formally a case, didn't proceed. Russo has said that something about the officer's brief report troubled him in a way he couldn't initially articulate. It was months later, lying awake one night turning the day over in his mind the way he'd taken to doing more often than he liked, that he placed it. The responding officers had described the apartment as clean, orderly, and pleasantly ventilated, nothing matching what he'd witnessed himself hours earlier that same day. Not the blanket-covered windows, not the smell, not the mother's appearance. 2 completely different apartments, described by 2 sets of people who'd stood in the same physical space only hours apart. The family vacated the apartment 3 weeks later, in the middle of the night, without notice, leaving behind most of their furniture and forfeiting their security deposit. The other tenants on the 4th floor reported hearing the moving happen. Not a moving truck, nothing so organized, but the sound of footsteps on the stairs. Repeated trips, going on for nearly 2 hours sometime after midnight, conducted in near total silence apart from the footsteps themselves. Nobody saw a vehicle. Nobody saw the family leave. Russo went in to assess the unit for re-rental and found the back hallway, the one the mother had emerged from during his first visit, led to a small windowless room that building blueprints listed as a utility closet, but which had clearly been converted, at some point, into livable space. The original utility shelving torn out and replaced with crude framing, a mattress on the floor, 2 mattresses. Actually, small ones, child-sized, stained in ways Russo has declined to describe in detail, and on every wall, floor to ceiling, in a child's handwriting in some places and what looked like an adult's in others. The same 6 words repeated thousands of times, overlapping, layered on top of each other until the original wall color was barely visible beneath the ink and pencil and, in places, what forensic cleaners later confirmed was dried blood used as a medium when other writing implements had presumably run out. Russo has said that some of the writing, the earliest layers visible underneath the rest, was neat, careful, almost decorative, the kind of handwriting a child uses when they're proud of their penmanship. The writing got progressively more frantic the closer it got to the surface. The most recent layer barely legible, gouged into the drywall hard enough in places to tear through to the lath beneath. Russo has only ever repeated those 6 words once, in the original forum post, before later editing the post to remove them after what he described as people reaching out who shouldn't have known to ask. He has since refused, across every subsequent retelling, to repeat the phrase again, citing a vague but consistent fear that saying it aloud, or even writing it down, invites something he doesn't have a name for. He has said only that the phrase made grammatical sense, that it wasn't gibberish or a child's nonsense rhyme, and that understanding what it meant was, in his words, worse than not understanding it would have been. The family was never located. Russo filed reports with the building owner, who in turn made a report to police, but with no crime definitively established. No missing persons report ever filed by any party with standing to file one. No relative, no school. No employer noticing an absence worth reporting, and a family who had simply moved out in the way thousands of tenants move out every year. The case went nowhere. The building owner, more concerned with liability than mystery, had the room resealed, repainted, and reclassified back to a utility closet on the official floor plan within the month. Russo quietly negotiated his way out of his contract with the building's ownership group 8 months later and left property management permanently. Citing burnout to anyone who asked, he said one more thing. In the most recent and final retelling he's given, on a podcast appearance he did under condition of voice alteration and anonymity, he said that periodically, usually late at night, usually when he's tired and his guard is down, he still hears those 6 words in his head, in a voice that isn't his own, and that he has never been able to determine whether it's a memory of reading them on that wall, or something else entirely, something that followed him out of that apartment and has been with him, quietly, ever since. He's described it as less like a memory and more like a presence that occasionally chooses to speak. Always the same 6 words. Always in that same flat, affectless tone the mother had used the day he found her in that way. He ended that podcast appearance by saying he hopes, sincerely, that none of the people listening ever find out what those 6 words were. He said some doors, once you open them, don't close again, and he said it in a voice, according to the host who was present for the recording, that made everyone in the room go quiet for a long moment before anyone could think of anything to say. One last detail, passed along by the podcast host afterward in a brief follow-up post, has stuck with the small community of listeners who tracked down the original episode. After the recording ended and the microphones were off, Russo reportedly asked the host, almost offhandedly, whether the studio they were in had a basement. It didn't. He seemed relieved to hear it, and didn't explain why he'd asked. 6 stories, 6 accounts from 6 different people who, as far as anyone can verify, never met each other, never compared notes, never had a reason to coordinate anything. Make of that what you will. I want to be honest with you about something before you go. I don't know, with certainty, that every detail in tonight's stories happened exactly the way they were described to me. That's true of almost everything in this genre. Second-hand accounts, decades-old case files, people protecting their own privacy by changing names and blurring locations. What I can tell you is that I didn't invent the unease. Every one of these stories came from somewhere. Somebody sat across from a camera, or typed into a forum at 2 in the morning, or talked quietly into a recorder, because they needed to put what happened to them somewhere outside their own head, whether you believe every detail or none of them. That part is real. If any of these felt a little too close to something you've experienced yourself, I want to hear about it. Drop it in the comments, or send it to me directly. Some of the best stories I've ever covered on this channel started exactly that way. A comment, A DM, someone who finally decided it was time to tell somebody. I read every single one, even the ones that take me a while to get back to. If you made it this far, do me a favor and hit subscribe, because I've got more of these every week, and trust me, there are stories in my inbox right now that make tonight's lineup look tame. One of them, which I'm still working up the nerve to fully verify, involves a basement very similar to the one you just heard about. I'll let you sit with that, lock your doors, check the closet, and maybe, just for tonight, leave a light on. I'll see you in the next Any